this next topic, when you brought it up a little while back, I was pretty excited to do it because I think it's a topic that was brought up or mentioned God knows how many times during the last election in 2016. So what are we going to be going through today?
Well, since the 1950s or so, the United States has been a key partner in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. And I thought we could take a look at it, see its relevance today, whether or not it's still as important as it was during the Cold War, and what does it do? What purpose does it serve? So I thought it might be interesting if we took a look at NATO.
Awesome. Let's do it. You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
and John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting.
All right, John, so let me ask you if you can just kind of break it down. What is NATO? Like, how did they come about? Tell us about, like, kind of the NATO 101.
NATO is a collection of countries that formed an alliance based upon defense to kind of counterbalance Soviet influence throughout Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact that the Soviets had with Poland kind of was the counterbalance to it up until the time the Soviet Union collapsed. But strategically, what it is a pact that says if one country is attacked by another country, one NATO country is attacked by another country that is not a part of NATO, then all of the countries in NATO respond to it. And those attacks have broadened over the years, from military attacks to cyber warfare to economic type of attacks as well. So it's a strategic partnership with the specific intent of deterring another Germany or another Soviet takeover.
So it is, it's, for lack of a better term, just, strength in numbers. So these smaller, like Baltic or Eastern European state, aren't states, but nation states, meaning states, aren't going to be one by one slowly, picked off by, as you said, like a Nazi Germany example or, Soviet Russia.
It's a big brother effect. When you have powerful allies such as the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada operating and working for your national best interests, and you're a tiny little country, that comes in extremely useful to deterring Russian or Soviet aggression.
Yeah, and so with this, is this a group almost like a UN where they meet frequently, where they collaborate frequently? So there is like a place and a...
There is a chief of NATO. There is a head of it. They frequently meet. And, once a nation is attacked, then they invoke something called Article 5, which rallies all the nations of NATO to respond. So the most recent one that we can point to is 9/11. After 9/11, NATO states were involved in the Afghan occupation and response to 9/11. So it's a useful program that, yes, there are states that, as President Trump says, aren't spending the same amount of their GDP, but you also have to take into consideration that there's a lot of states that just don't have the economy of the United States. And a lot of that is based upon their geography, which we'll look at in a minute.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I noticed when I was kind of looking into it, what I found interesting is it's like there's the separate branch of NATO that is almost dedicated to military intelligence.
Yeah.
And it was almost like just so emphasizing the intelligence that agents get, operatives get, overseas and in these countries that seem to be like, I can't wait to go over things geographically with the importance there, but it's like we might not be at war right now with like Soviet Russia or anything like that, or with Russia, but we're gathering intelligence from people who provide very valuable information, it seems.
Yeah. I've been reading a book that talks about the geography of it, and like I said, we'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that NATO did was it put, as the book describes, it put France and Germany in a tight embrace, so tight that they couldn't swing at one another, right? So they're not naturally friendly.
Right.
But
right.
this partnership, combined with the EU, has put France and Germany into the same boat as far as their defense and their economies. These are the largest, industrial states in Europe, outside of the UK, and it's very important that they have a peaceful transition of goods and services and so forth. The reason NATO is key right now is because most of the people that live in Europe are living in a post-war Europe. They haven't grown up with war. But there has been war in Europe for the past 700 years.
Yeah.
And so this new generation really doesn't understand why those wars, well, they may understand it historically, but they don't really, they are relying on NATO without even knowing they're relying on NATO. It's an important part of Europe and the European Union right now, and it's one of the key factors of peace throughout all of Europe.
I mean, when you said that, it almost kind of made me think of the sentiment I've heard that we aren't as tough, and we're a little too soft because we come after the generation that had to defend us during World War II and fight and do all of that. So it's kind of the same thing. Like there are a lot of people now in Europe, part of because how many? It looks like 28, 29 countries.
29, and originally it was like 6.
Right, and so we have 29 countries all across like Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and so you're right. Like a lot of them my age, 30s or 20s, younger, and didn't really grow up seeing that significance or seeing the toll, particularly that any war could have taken on their countries.
Yeah, and you also have to understand that some of these countries that are joining NATO are former Soviet republics.
Right.
That may have some, Russian nationals in it that have a lot of Russian influence on them already. And that's one of the keys to kind of unlocking Russian aggression, is to deter them through NATO incorporating these countries into NATO.
Right.
One of the ones that is a red line for the Russians is Ukraine. If Ukraine joins NATO, that is a provocation to the Russians.
Right.
Crimea, which the Russians annexed, is 60% Russian-speaking. Ukraine made kind of an idiotic move in 2014, and they decided to eliminate Russian as the second language of Ukraine, which kind of fueled the anti-Ukraine sentiment in Crimea. So Ukrainian troops pulled out of Crimea largely due to that sentiment rising up. And then, the troops, the Russian troops that were stationed at the naval bases there simply just took to the streets and coordinated with Russian nationals that were living there. So the Ukrainians were somewhat overwhelmed and they just left. And so Putin essentially annexed Crimea as a result of this. Now, had they been a part of NATO, that would have been war. That would have been a world war right there.
Right.
But strategically, Putin played his cards best and took Crimea. And the reason Crimea is so critical to the Russians is it's the only warm water port in all of Russia.
Oh, okay.
They still have an uphill battle from that port, but they have to go through the Black Sea. And then past Istanbul, which is controlled by Turkey and is a NATO country. And on the other side of that strait is Greece, which is also a NATO country. And they either have to go through, the Strait of Gibraltar or through the Suez Canal in order to have a naval power. And right now, that's what Russia struggles with, is a naval power. And we'll take a look at Russia in a little bit. But the reality just kind of boils down to NATO is there as a major deterrent to, aggression, which initially was German, kind of the concept of German aggression and one powerful state just railroading and taking everything over, and they wanted to protect from that. And that slowly shifted their focus to the Soviet Union and keeping them contained.
Soviet Russia was clearly being problematic and anti-West, anti-democratic, which, and the reason that is so threatening or such a terrible thing is because democracy is the absolute core, fundamental foundation for the prevention of like a Nazi Germany,
right,
or a Soviet, communist country like Soviet Russia. Democracy prevents that. Period. End of story.
Yeah.
And so, but Nazi Germany topples, and then Soviet Russia just is like that pesky thing that just won't effing go away.
Yeah.
And I think because they just, for several reasons, I mean, geographic landmass, a lot of people just didn't, it wasn't like a place we wanted to like go to war with.
Right.
And, everyone was kind of sick of war, but they were becoming an increasing threat. So, and they were under Stalin particularly, weren't they, just gobbling up slowly one by one.
Yeah,
these Eastern European countries.
Kind of a philosophy of Ivan the Terrible. Is that who it was? I forget. One of their former czars, who
fearless leaders. They're great. Yeah.
He basically developed a philosophy of doing exactly what you're talking about, slowly taking over, creeping through, creating influence, and then hunkering down. Democracy is a blanket Putin wears, but underneath that blanket is an authoritarian. And he is not in any way ideological. He is not a communist. He's not a fascist. He is somebody that believes in the police state and will use power, influence, extortion, murder, poisoning, crime. He'll use all of that to achieve his means. He is through and through a KGB agent. And he is all about collecting compromise and extorting materials on neighboring states. This is why Ukraine is so volatile. If a large percentage of the population speaks Russian, you can spread propaganda very easily against Western ideals in Ukraine. So when Putin took Crimea, for example, there was a lot of Westerners who were relieved that Ukraine was not in NATO at that time.
Yeah, and I mean, with Putin, it's funny, like his philosophy, I've seen clips of certain interviews he's done and everything on Russian television, and it kind of gives you insight into his core philosophies, his beliefs, and his views, his worldview, and everything. And he is, like you said, he's not fascist or communist, but he is 100% anti-democracy.
Yes.
Because
he sees it as mob rule.
Mob rule, but not just that. Like, it was crazy. If you watch some interviews, the way he talks about like the common man is so deprecating, and he'll say, "Oh, can you imagine the average Russian man just sitting at home and then like having any real responsibilities, like voting, ha ha ha,"
Yeah.
like joking, as if his view is that a common person isn't smart enough to make the right decision, isn't wise enough, isn't like he really believes that if you're a working class or middle class Russian or American or anyone, you're like a peasant who has no idea what's good for you. And it's so bizarre. Like he really does. He has that authoritarian mindset, but at least under Soviet Russia, like they pretended to say like, oh, it's because poor people matter, and then but then they implement policies that are just like absolutely horrific, and then but he doesn't even pretend, and then the audience is kind of laughing like, oh yeah, the average person has no idea what's good for that. It's almost, even though his elections are rigged to begin with, it's almost a way of like just demoralizing someone into voting for you. Like, you have no idea. Get people to just be so down on themselves that, like, of course, well, Vladimir knows what's best for him. So what's best for us, rather. Yeah.
Most of his elections are falsified.
Yeah. I mean,
And he always has an attitude of, what? What did I do? What are you looking at me for? What did I do? Right? This comes from his KGB days. He was stationed in Dresden, which was in Eastern Europe or Eastern Germany during the Cold War. And he very quickly realized that one of the things outside of collecting information on your own citizens was creating a black market. And he made a great deal of money, selling Western goods into Moscow from Dresden. And then when the collapse came, he lost everything. He lost his national identity. He lost his outlook. He just saw, he hated Gorbachev. He thought
I bet, yeah.
He was a weak leader who undermined the Soviet Union. And, he swore to reestablish it. And he went and he worked for a guy named, I believe it's Sobchak, who was a mayor in, at the time it was called Leningrad, but it soon turned back into St. Petersburg. And he just ripped off the town. Both of them did. And basically what they did was, any goods coming in, they stole and then would sell back to their people on the black market. And you saw these photos in the early 90s of Russia and, empty stores and lights being shut off and long bread lines and so forth. A lot of that was due to the corruption inside of Russia. And this is how the Russians operate. They don't see commerce the same way the Westerners do. They don't see democracy the same way we do. They are the exact opposite in every way as to what we consider ideals, to function in the world. And we set those guidelines and those barriers for entry into NATO, as well as the European Union setting those guidelines as for entry into the EU. Mm-hmm. And you have to root out corruption, mainly that a secret word for root out Russian influence, mm-hmm. right? And in order to join these unions, you have to have free and open elections, and you have to have a rule of law that protects the smallest among you. And if the Russians have their way, they'll overturn that. And we can see that happening in a lot of countries like Moldova, Ukraine, Latvia. There's all these old Russian republics that Putin flexes his muscle in, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and so forth. And the goal is to undermine them with propaganda and get them to turn away from the Western market towards the Russian market. And that's where Putin's real power is in oil and natural gas. And now that the Americans are using, the shale oil production to make natural gas, we have become the largest supplier of natural gas to the European Union. And what we do is we have something that is called LNG, which is liquefied natural gas. We extract it, we liquefy it, we ship it, and we take it to a port in Europe where they turn it back into gas. And we're doing this all the time, and they're using less and less Russian gas. And Russia, or all of the EU, as I understand it, uses about 25%, of their gas is Russian. Well, that number increases sharply the closer you get to Moscow. So all those states along Russia's border are 100% reliant. So where's their influence going to be?
Right.
Right? And if they slowly start to switch to clean renewable energy, or we crack that code, what's going to happen to Russia? And likewise, what's going to happen to other fossil fuel countries? We look throughout the world, who's causing all the havoc? Mm-hmm. Russia, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, right? They're all oil producers, and they're seeing the trend. They're seeing Australia on fire. Mm-hmm. How much longer are the people going to put up with that, right? So if we slowly start to transition, Russia's influence and power goes with it.
Yeah, and so, because Russia, economically, oil and natural gas, because they have they don't have seasons that are very amicable for farming.
Not really.
Variety. It's potato. I know that's kind of a
Wheat is
wheat,
main, yeah.
potato. It's almost a joke, but it's not a joke. It's true.
Yeah.
They potatoes and I think vodka and oil and gas, and there's that's about it. They have, especially for the size of the country, it is almost embarrassing how few tourists go. Like most countries, based on the size, typically the bigger you are, the more sightseeing places you have and the
Yeah.
more destinations there are. But in Russia, like most people just go to Moscow, check it out for a bit, come back. Like there's not a huge bustling tourist economy. They, I think, they're being on an independent currency still, like, and they haven't really benefited in it in terms of like the technological revolution, like we've seen China and India do, and parts of other Asian countries. They haven't really embraced it. I think.
I think
yeah.
on that point, I think it's the Western world has failed to embrace them because they just don't trust them.
Yeah, that's true too. And as a result, we see like what we did see during communism is, whatever we have, they have too. But after the wall came down and more information came out, their cars were just a joke. Technology, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same, but technology is one of those things where you have to know what the other person's got.
Yeah.
Like with Western Europe, we can see what cards they have, like, because they're face up. We know what infrastructure, the speed of their internet, the hardware, the infrastructure on a national level, on a scale, because that is important to understand the likelihood and severity of cyber attacks, how to prepare for it, and everything. But if you can't see behind that curtain, you have no idea what. And that's why I think it is hard for a lot of people to really grasp, wait, so Russia did some hacking and cyber attack, and we see them not as this very developed nation, but they don't have to be in order to.
Well, when the head of your country is just trained in counterintelligence,
Right.
and that's their only background and love in life, then you're going to have a state that operates in that way. And he'll do whatever he can. I mean, there's little stuff that the Russians do that's actually kind of brilliant, but at the same time terrifying. One thing they did was they sent Russians to an American base, and just dropped some thumb drives outside the base. Right? And so the Americans are walking along on their patrol and they see a thumb drive and go, what the hell's this? Whose is this? Let's plug it in and see what it is. And there's a virus on there. Right? That's the type of stuff the Russians do.
Right.
They're always looking to penetrate defenses and push and then go, what? The Americans do it too. Right? And the thing about Russia, you kind of mentioned it, but it's an enormous country. It's 11 time zones wide.
Right.
And a lot of it's above the Arctic Circle.
Mm-hmm.
So, that limits your tourism options. It also limits your naval activities because all your warm water ports don't even exist. You have ports that are frozen 5 months out of the year, right? So how do you become a superpower in that? Well, the main way is through chief exports, oil and natural gas. But if Western countries are saying we're putting sanctions on you and we're blockading your naval activities, it's all about containing the Russians. So what I want to take a look at next is just kind of the geography of Europe and how this is playing into this whole thing, and then kind of the modern view of where NATO is right now.
Yeah, let's take a look.
So, Josh, I thought we would start with this map that you just pulled up and threw in the shared drive. Tell me what this map is outlining.
Yeah, so this map is really interesting. It's a map of Europe, Western and Eastern. It's got a part of Russia in there, and it is basically highlighting the member states of NATO, but based on the year. So starting at year 1949, and it's in deep, deep blue, deep navy blue, and then it slowly gets newer, like 1949, 1952, 55, and it gets lighter to light green or light blue, and then it goes from blue to green. So, for instance, 1949, very dark blue. 1982, newer, is very light blue. And then it goes to light green up to 2009. So, and the reason this kind of stood out to me is you have Western countries, with the exception, I think Spain was a late joiner late 1982. But you have, UK, France, Germany. You have Italy joining early in 1949. And then as you start going east, looking through the nations, Eastern European ones, the nations get lighter and lighter, and it's almost like NATO is spreading. And this goes up through 2009. Only a few joiners, but key joiners in 2009, but many in 2004. Which wasn't that long ago. So it's not like, oh, these are countries that have been in it for 70 years. This is like, 10 years ago, there's still several countries joining over and over. Like, so this is a current thing that is still growing, and that must play into...
Oh, it totally does.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if the United States broke in half, let's say on the Civil War lines, right? And the southern United States was largely influenced by the Russians, and the Russians were putting military hardware in those states. That is how they see NATO. Okay, they see it as an encroachment. They see it as a provocation. They see it as a Western influence in a part of the world that they know well, right? And Putin will routinely say that NATO has broken the rules by incorporating states into NATO that were parts of the former Soviet Republic, and NATO had sworn to never do that. NATO's like, we never made such a claim.
Right.
But Putin believes it, and he's one of those guys that once he believes something, you can't make him unbelieve it. And he kind of operates in those sort of, narrow worldviews. So as NATO spreads across Eastern Europe, it is an encroachment on him, and one that makes him very, very nervous. So he has started a counterbalance to this, and it's all through propaganda. And that's why I wanted to kind of talk about the geography of Europe. Europe is kind of split right across the middle of it. Geographically, there are mountain ranges that go all through Spain and Italy and Greece and countries like Romania and Hungary, and they have very little agricultural products. And which ones they do, it's immensely difficult historically for them to trade with Northern Europe because they have to go over mountain ranges. There's no rivers that connect them. They have to have a large navy to go through the English Channel in order to have trade with Northern Europe. Northern Europe is largely agricultural and industrial. It's densely populated. It's where all the money is, and it's where all the commerce is. So these lower states, these Mediterranean states, are relegated to trading with the other Mediterranean states, such as Northern African states, which aren't heavy in resources. So when you have a refugee crisis in the Middle East, and all these refugees are starting to make their way into Europe, that impacts those on the southern border more than it impacts those in the northern border. And the European Union has outlined certain immigration policies that stipulate how many refugees each country has to take in. Well, Great Britain greatly resents those rules, which is why they're pulling out of the European Union, because xenophobia through Europe is a constant thing, and you can wind people up very easily and trigger lifelong, centuries-long disputes between these countries. And there's a lot of resentment in the southern European states towards the northern European states, and likewise. So the northern European states, after the financial collapse, felt they had to go down and bail out all these countries.
Well, Germany particular. I mean, Germany like basically prevented Europe from becoming an economic Chernobyl, like wasteland. Yeah.
Well, Greece was kind of padding the books, right?
Oh,
Right?
yeah. Don't get me started there.
Yeah, but they were making all these claims that their finances were in alignment, when in reality people were retiring at 55. They had all these kind of social programs in there that the EU was footing the bill for. And so when they got a hold of the books, they're like, hey, we're not gonna do this anymore, and it caused all these revolts and riots and so forth. So there's a lot of, and at the same time, the Greeks were kind of like, why do we need the Germans telling us what to do when we were a key ally in defeating them?
Right.
So there's this kind of old school resentment in there as well.
Like abiding the hand that fed them. And then, there was, like intercontinental feuds that may not have been outright war, but were extremely consequential, nonetheless.
And then, if you take that and then you have an immigration, policy that is bringing a lot of Middle Easterners in, and you stoke and fan that flame and gaslight people in those countries and raise the fear level over terrorism and Islamic rule and things like that. The French are dealing with all these like, well, should we allow burqas in public? Should we not? And then if a larger percentage of your population is changing, that creates a great deal of fear, and the Russians are capitalizing on that in order to get their fingers in between the states of the EU. So if they can get these countries to focus internally on their problems instead of, being more communal,
right,
then that helps the Russians steer influence throughout the region.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my opinion at least, the big mistake that was made, or what could have made things so much better with this whole migrant crisis and how it's been handled, is the difference of what they did versus what they should have done. The EU is, what they did was say, John Walsh, you need to make sure you need to make sure you're ready to take in 8 new refugees in your house, instead of saying, John Walsh, you need to, by this date, come forth and tell us how many people you can take.
Right.
It was, nope, you need to accommodate for this. And even if these people, like, yes, I agree, like, we shouldn't just like turn migrants away who are fleeing absolute horrific situations in life and everything, and genocide, a lot of them fleeing from. I think that small distinction is huge. If they said like, hey, you need to tell us how many, then it feels like you have a say in it.
Right.
And I think because we're also very tribal in nature, human beings, the very idea of like, we don't like politicians, 50 miles away telling us what to do, let alone another nation. And I think there is going to be conflict, and it's like there's a social experiment that is done for anybody who tries to believe that we aren't a tribal, or that only some of us are tribal. There's a social experiment that's done by basically every sociology, psychology student, major or doctorate ever, and you go into a room with a diverse group of people, political backgrounds, ages, everything, political beliefs, and you give them each a sticker, either red or blue, or it's green or blue or green or yellow. Like they choose colors that have no political affiliation or anything.
Gotcha.
And they put a sticker on their clothes, and they go, okay, oh shoot, I forgot something, I'll be back in just a few minutes. They come back 5 minutes later, and all the people with a yellow sticker are huddled, talking to one another, mingling. And it's like there's no significance. It's a sticker on your clothes.
Those stickers can be language, or they can be a religion.
Exactly.
Or they could be a geographical area, or a certain type of food source or energy source, right?
Yeah, and imagine if the yellow sticker group and the green sticker group each elect a leader, and then suddenly the yellow sticker group makes a rule that the green sticker group has to follow. Mm-hmm. And even if it's a good rule, you're going to hate it because of that tribalism. And even though I would have personally voted to stay in versus voted for Brexit if I was there, I don't. I at least understand why there is the sentiment, and I think you're right. There's absolutely a percentage of people who are xenophobic about it.
And nationalistic.
Nationalistic, and then other people who honestly feel like a lot of working class people and middle class people in America feel. They say they're looking at politicians going, look, you're not allowed to make us sit in the back seat anymore. There is a very real, very tangible tension that is still there. And like you said, even something as almost benign as a language difference, even languages that are rooted in the same way, like that are so similar that they can even understand each other, that is such a divide. That is a yellow sticker, green sticker situation.
Yeah. And when you have like immigrants coming in, like I think Germany took over 1 million immigrants. Yep. Eventually that's going to influence public policy, right? You're going to have people who use, their religious background to form their political ideologies, and those ideologies may be anti-Western. It'll influence how NATO reacts to other nations being attacked, right? If that nation happens to be an Islamic nation, how will the citizens that have migrated there view that? How do you get them into, the German system or German ideals when Germany has a checkered past, more than checkered past?
Well, it's funny you mention that, because I was just about to say that there is, at least among like I follow a lot of economists and who have said that regarding the bailout and especially immigration, Germany is known, and Angela Merkel is just raked over coals about how many migrants they've just taken in open arms, blindfolded or whatever. But they say, look, I guarantee you some advisor or advisors pulled her into a room privately and said, look, it's still like fresh enough. Germany cannot be the nation that turns people in need away. That looks like, with their past, like it was almost...
Especially based on racial or ethnic identity.
Yeah, like she was in a position where she had... It was like damned if you do, damned if you don't, and the consequences thereof. And also the desire to be the leader of the pack in Europe, after the bailout and everything.
We have to be serious, though. The leader of the pack has always been the United States.
Yes.
And the United States carries a very, very heavy stick. And the feeling in some of the neighboring states to Russia, like Ukraine, Moldova, and Latvia, and Estonia, is Washington's on the other side of the world, and Moscow is next door. Thanks for listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And make sure you check out our website for other episodes, itmightbeinteresting.com. And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com.